In the shadowed corridors of power, where whispers carry more weight than gold and loyalty is bought with blood, one woman believed herself untouchable. Camilla Worthington had climbed the treacherous ladder of high society through calculated moves and buried secrets, her elegant smile hiding a heart as cold as winter stone. But every empire built on deception has its weaknesses, and every predator eventually becomes prey. Tonight, in the opulent dining room where she had orchestrated the downfall of countless others, the hunter would finally face the hunted. A loyal guard, armed with damning evidence and years of suppressed rage, would shatter her world with 4 simple words that would echo through the marble halls like a death knell. Some sins can be forgiven, some secrets can be buried. But poison leaves traces that even the most powerful cannot erase, and justice, though delayed, never truly dies. The end was coming, and this time there would be nowhere to run. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany table as Camilla Worthington surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a queen reviewing her conquered territories. The Worthington estate had been in her late husband's family for 3 generations, but it was she who had transformed it from a mere symbol of old money into a fortress of political influence and social control.
Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every servant who moved through the halls served her greater purpose.
Camilla was not born into wealth. Her origins lay in the grimy industrial district of Manchester, where her father worked double shifts at a textile mill and her mother took in washing to make ends meet. But even as a child, she possessed something that set her apart from her peers, an almost supernatural ability to read people's weaknesses and desires. While other children played with dolls or kicked footballs in the narrow streets, young Camilla would sit in the local library, devouring books about history's most successful women, studying how they had clawed their way to power in a world that wanted to keep them silent and submissive. Her transformation began at 17 when she caught the attention of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a wealthy widow who frequented the charity events in Manchester's poorest neighbourhoods. Mrs. Blackwood saw something special in the sharp-eyed girl who spoke with a confidence that belied her humble circumstances. She offered Camilla a position as her personal assistant, a role that would take her to London and introduce her to circles she could never have imagined. Under Mrs. Blackwood's tutelage, Camilla learned the intricate dance of high society. She studied how the wealthy spoke, how they moved, how they wielded their influence like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and deadly. She observed how information flowed through dinner parties and charity galas, how a whispered word in the right ear could destroy a reputation or elevate a nobody to prominence. Most importantly, she learned that power was not inherited. It was taken by those bold enough to seize it. The lessons came at a price. Mrs. Blackwood was a demanding teacher who expected perfection in everything from table manners to political analysis. She would quiz Camilla on the genealogies of important families, test her knowledge of financial markets, and critique her posture with the ruthlessness of a military drill sergeant. But Camilla embraced every challenge, knowing that each humiliation brought her closer to her ultimate goal. Her first real test came during a garden party at the Blackwood estate. Among the guests was Lord Harrison Worthington, a man 20 years her senior who had recently lost his wife to consumption. He was wealthy beyond measure, connected to everyone who mattered in British politics, and utterly lost in his grief. Camilla saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. She approached him not with sympathy, which he received in abundance from other guests, but with intelligent conversation about the economic implications of the American Civil War on British textile imports. Her knowledge impressed him, but it was her subtle understanding of his loneliness that sealed their connection. Over the following months, she positioned herself as his intellectual companion, the one person who could discuss his business concerns without the false cheerfulness that characterized most of his social interactions. Their courtship was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Camilla never appeared desperate or eager. Instead, she created a sense of scarcity around her attention, making him work to earn her company. She would agree to dinner invitations only after appropriate hesitation, express interest in his opinions while subtly steering conversations toward topics where she could demonstrate her intelligence and show just enough vulnerability to make him feel protective without appearing weak. The wedding was the social event of the season. Mrs. Blackwood watched with pride as her protégée walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, transformed from a mill worker's daughter into Lady Worthington. But even in her moment of triumph, Camilla was already planning her next moves. Marriage to Lord Worthington was not the destination. It was merely the vehicle that would carry her to true power. Within 6 months of their wedding, she had learned everything about her husband's business dealings, political connections, and financial assets. She studied his correspondence, memorized his allies and enemies, and began building her own network of information sources. The servants, initially wary of the new mistress who had risen so far above her station, gradually became her eyes and ears throughout London society. Her husband, grateful for her interest in his affairs, began including her in business meetings and political discussions. He marveled at her quick grasp of complex issues and her ability to suggest solutions he had not considered. What he did not realize was that Camilla had already analyzed every problem, researched every option, and prepared her responses long before the meetings began. The transformation of their social circle was gradual but deliberate. Camilla identified the most influential guests at their dinner parties and began cultivating relationships with their spouses, particularly the wives, who were often overlooked in political discussions but wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. She organized charitable committees that gave her access to the most powerful women in London, hosted salons where artists and intellectuals mingled with politicians and industrialists, and gradually positioned herself as an indispensable connector in London's elite social network. Her success was not without its casualties. Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had previously been considered the unofficial queen of London society, found her invitations declining as hostesses chose between including her or Camilla at their events. Sir Reginald Ashworth, a longtime friend of her husband's, discovered that his insider trading schemes had somehow become public knowledge after he had foolishly confided in Camilla during a dinner party. She never confronted her rivals directly. Instead, she orchestrated their downfall with the patience of a spider weaving her web. The servants at Worthington Manor learned quickly that their new mistress demanded absolute loyalty. Those who served her well found their wages increased and their working conditions improved. Those who showed any sign of disloyalty discovered that positions in other great houses had mysteriously become unavailable to them. Camilla understood that power required both rewards and consequences, and she was generous with both. Her husband's health began to decline in their third year of marriage. The long hours he devoted to his business empire, combined with the stress of maintaining their increasingly complex social obligations, took their toll on his constitution. Camilla played the role of devoted wife perfectly, hiring the best physicians, organizing his medications, and ensuring he received the finest care money could provide. She also began taking on more of his business responsibilities, attending meetings in his place and making decisions that he would later ratify from his sickbed. The transition of power was so gradual that most people failed to notice it happening. By the time Lord Worthington passed away peacefully in his sleep, Camilla had already been effectively running his empire for months. The will, which left everything to his beloved wife, surprised no one who knew them. What did surprise some observers was how quickly and efficiently she consolidated her control over businesses, investments, and political connections that had taken him decades to build. As a widow, Camilla faced new challenges but also new opportunities. Society expected her to retreat into mourning and gradually fade from public life, perhaps remarrying a suitable gentleman who could manage her inherited wealth. Instead, she used her grief as a shield while she strengthened her position. She attended fewer social events but made each appearance count, speaking with such wisdom and composure that other widows sought her advice and younger wives competed for her approval. Her home became a salon where the most important conversations in London took place. Politicians would arrive for dinner and find themselves seated next to journalists, industrialists, and foreign diplomats. The information that flowed through her dining room was more valuable than anything traded on the London Stock Exchange, and Camilla was the broker who controlled every transaction. She never remarried, despite receiving numerous proposals from men who coveted her wealth or genuinely loved her. Marriage would have meant sharing power, and Camilla had worked too hard to reach the summit to allow anyone else to claim a portion of her kingdom. She cultivated an image of eternal devotion to her late husband's memory, while privately enjoying the freedom that widowhood provided. Her charitable work expanded her influence even further. She established foundations that provided education for working-class children, medical care for the poor, and support for war widows. But every charitable act served her larger purposes. The schools she funded produced grateful graduates who became her allies in government and business. The hospitals she supported gave her connections with the medical establishment that would prove useful in ways she had not yet imagined. The widows she helped became a network of information sources throughout London and beyond. By her 50th birthday, Camilla Worthington had achieved something unprecedented for a woman of her era. She was not merely wealthy or well-connected. She was powerful in her own right. Politicians sought her endorsement, business leaders courted her investment, and social climbers dreamed of receiving her approval. She had transformed herself from a mill worker's daughter into one of the most influential people in Victorian England. But power, as she would learn, was not a permanent possession. It was a living thing that required constant feeding, careful nurturing, and ruthless protection. And there were always those who watched from the shadows, waiting for the moment when even the most careful predator would finally reveal a weakness that could be exploited. The seeds of her downfall had been planted years earlier, in moments when her focus on the larger game had caused her to overlook seemingly insignificant details. A loyal servant dismissed for a minor infraction, a business rival humiliated beyond what was necessary, a political enemy crushed when mere defeat would have sufficed. Each of these moments created someone with a reason to remember, someone with a motive to watch and wait for the opportunity to strike back. Among these forgotten enemies was Thomas Fletcher, a guard who had served the Worthington household faithfully for 15 years. He had watched the transformation of his master's young wife into the iron-willed woman who now ruled their world. He had seen things that others missed, heard conversations that were meant to remain private, and gradually pieced together a picture that revealed the true nature of the woman they all served. Thomas had learned to be invisible, to perform his duties with such quiet efficiency that powerful people forgot he was there when they spoke of things that could destroy reputations or end lives. He had watched Camilla orchestrate the social destruction of people who had crossed her, witnessed her cold calculation in moments when others saw only grief or compassion, and slowly realized that the woman he had sworn to protect might be the most dangerous person he had ever encountered. But Thomas was patient, just as Camilla had been patient in her rise to power. He understood that accusations against someone so powerful required more than suspicion or circumstantial evidence. He needed proof that was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even her vast network of allies could not protect her. And so he waited, watched, and carefully gathered the evidence that would eventually bring down the woman who believed herself untouchable. Thomas Fletcher had not always been invisible. In his younger days, he had been a soldier in Her Majesty's army, serving with distinction in the Crimean War, before returning to London with medals on his chest and nightmares that would never fully fade. The discipline learned on battlefields had served him well in civilian life, but it was his ability to observe and remember details that made him invaluable to the Worthington household. When he first entered service at the manor, Lord Worthington was still a bachelor, consumed by grief over his first wife's death, and struggling to manage both his business empire and his emotional turmoil. Thomas had been hired as part of the security detail, but his military bearing and quiet competence soon earned him additional responsibilities. He became the eyes and ears of the household, the man who noticed when something was out of place, when a guest's behavior seemed suspicious, or when the staff required guidance in their duties. The arrival of Camilla had initially seemed like a blessing. The young woman brought energy and purpose back to the master's life, transforming the somber household into a vibrant center of social activity. Thomas watched with approval as she helped Lord Worthington emerge from his shell, encouraging him to entertain guests again and take active interest in his business affairs. He admired her intelligence, her grace under pressure, and her apparent devotion to her much older husband. But soldiers learn to notice details that others miss, and Thomas began to see patterns that troubled him. There was the way Camilla's expressions changed when she thought no one was watching, revealing a coldness that never appeared in public. There were the private conversations she held with certain guests, discussions that ended abruptly when servants entered the room. Most disturbing were the subtle changes in the household routine that seemed designed to give her access to areas and information that had previously been restricted. The first incident that truly alarmed Thomas occurred during a dinner party celebrating Lord Worthington's birthday. Among the guests was Sir Edmund Hartwell, a prominent judge who had recently ruled against one of Camilla's charitable organizations in a highly publicized case. Throughout the evening, Thomas noticed that Camilla paid special attention to Sir Edmund, ensuring his wine glass was never empty and personally serving him several courses from her position as hostess. Sir Edmund became violently ill during the carriage ride home. The physician who attended him diagnosed severe food poisoning, noting symptoms that suggested the consumption of contaminated shellfish. However, Thomas remembered that Sir Edmund had specifically mentioned his allergy to shellfish when declining the lobster course, and the servants had prepared a special meal for him that contained no seafood. More troubling was the fact that no other guest had experienced any illness, despite eating from the same kitchen. Thomas might have dismissed the incident as a coincidence, if not for what he observed in the days that followed. Sir Edmund's illness developed into a prolonged weakness that forced him to retire from several important cases, including one that involved a business partnership dispute that could have cost Lord Worthington a significant sum. Camilla expressed appropriate concern for their guest's health, while privately meeting with lawyers who benefited from the judge's absence from the courtroom. Over the following months, Thomas documented similar patterns. Guests who opposed Camilla's interests seemed unusually prone to sudden illnesses, accidents, or scandals that removed them from positions where they could cause trouble. A newspaper editor who had written critically about her charitable foundations was found in a compromising situation with a young woman who turned out to be in Camilla's employ. A business rival suffered a heart attack after a dinner meeting, dying just days before he was scheduled to present evidence of financial irregularities in one of Lord Worthington's companies. Each incident could be explained away as coincidence or misfortune, but the accumulating pattern painted a darker picture. Thomas began to suspect that his mistress was not merely ruthless in business and politics, she was actively eliminating obstacles to her ambitions through methods that left no obvious trace. His suspicions were confirmed during a late evening when he was conducting his regular security rounds. Passing by Camilla's private study, he heard voices from within and recognized the second speaker as Dr. Malcolm Pemberton, a physician who had recently been struck from the medical register for unethical practices. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the meeting without being detected. Pemberton was explaining the properties of a substance he claimed was undetectable in conventional medical examinations. The poison, derived from a rare plant found only in remote regions of South America, could simulate the symptoms of various natural ailments depending on the dosage and method of administration. In small amounts, it caused temporary illness that resembled food poisoning or influenza. In larger doses, it could trigger heart failure or respiratory collapse that would be attributed to natural causes. Camilla listened with the focused attention of a student taking notes on an important lecture. She asked detailed questions about preparation methods, storage requirements, and the timeline between administration and the onset of symptoms. Most chillingly, she inquired about techniques for introducing the substance into food or drink without detection by taste or smell. Thomas remained hidden until Dr. Pemberton departed through a side entrance that avoided the main areas of the house. The physician carried with him a substantial payment and a promise of future work, while Camilla retained several small vials containing what she had purchased. Thomas watched her lock the containers in a hidden compartment behind a false panel in her desk, a location she believed was known only to herself. The knowledge of what he had witnessed placed Thomas in an impossible position. His loyalty to Lord Worthington demanded that he protect his master from any threat, but accusing his wife of murder based on a single overheard conversation would likely result in Thomas's dismissal and disgrace. Camilla's power and influence meant that any accusations against her would require overwhelming evidence to be believed. Thomas decided to continue his surveillance while carefully documenting everything he observed. He began keeping a detailed journal, written in a simple code he had learned during his military service. Every suspicious incident, every unusual visitor, every change in household routine was recorded with the precision of a military intelligence report. He noted the dates when Camilla accessed her hidden cache of poison, cross-referencing them with subsequent social events where guests might be exposed to danger. The most disturbing entry in his journal concerned Lord Worthington himself. Thomas had begun to notice that his master's declining health coincided with periods when he showed signs of asserting independence from his wife's influence. Whenever Lord Worthington made business decisions without consulting Camilla, challenged her recommendations, or showed interest in other women at social events, he would soon develop symptoms that confined him to bed and made him dependent on his wife's care. Thomas observed the subtle ways Camilla administered what she claimed were beneficial tonics and medications. She personally prepared his evening tea, supervised his meals during his illness, and ensured that she was the only one who had access to his medicine cabinet. The pattern suggested that she was gradually weakening her husband while positioning herself as his indispensable caregiver. The realization that he was watching his master being slowly murdered filled Thomas with rage, but also with a grim determination to gather evidence that would bring justice. He began to collect samples of the substances Camilla added to Lord Worthington's food and drink, carefully preserving them in containers hidden in his own quarters. He documented the correlation between these administrations and his master's symptoms, building a case that even her most powerful allies could not dismiss. His investigation expanded to include Camilla's network of accomplices. Dr. Pemberton was only one of several disgraced professionals who provided specialized services in exchange for protection and compensation. There was a former solicitor who forged documents, a dismissed police inspector who manufactured evidence against her enemies, and a small army of servants and informants who carried out tasks that required discretion and absolute loyalty. Thomas learned that Camilla maintained detailed files on everyone in her social and business circles, documenting their secrets, weaknesses, and potential value as assets or threats. She knew which politicians had gambling debts, which society wives were conducting affairs, and which business leaders were engaged in questionable financial practices. This information gave her enormous leverage in negotiations and the ability to destroy anyone who crossed her. The most valuable intelligence Thomas gathered concerned Camilla's long-term plans. Through careful observation of her private meetings and correspondence, he learned that she intended to expand her influence beyond London's social elite. She was cultivating relationships with foreign diplomats, investigating opportunities in emerging markets, and positioning herself to profit from political changes that most people could not even imagine. Her ultimate goal appeared to be the creation of an international network of influence that would make her one of the most powerful people in Europe. She spoke of establishing businesses in America, forming partnerships with European aristocrats, and using her wealth to influence elections and government policies. The scope of her ambitions was breathtaking, and Thomas realized that the deaths and destruction she had caused thus far were merely the foundation for much greater crimes. As Lord Worthington's condition worsened, Thomas faced an agonizing decision. He could continue gathering evidence in hopes of eventually bringing Camilla to justice, but his master might not survive long enough to see that day. Alternatively, he could act immediately to save Lord Worthington's life, but without sufficient proof to ensure Camilla's conviction, she would likely escape punishment and possibly eliminate Thomas as a threat to her secrets. The decision was made for him when he discovered that Camilla had accelerated her timeline. During one of his surveillance sessions, he overheard her discussing plans with Dr. Meyer Pemberton for a final treatment that would end Lord Worthington's suffering permanently while ensuring that his death appeared to be the natural conclusion of his long illness. The administration was scheduled for the following evening, during a quiet dinner in the privacy of their dining room. Thomas realized that he had reached the moment every soldier dreads, when all the planning and preparation must give way to decisive action. He had gathered enough evidence to build a compelling case against Camilla, but proving her guilt in a court of law would take time that Lord Worthington no longer possessed. If he was going to save his master's life, he would have to confront Camilla directly, using the evidence he had collected to force her hand. That night, Thomas made his final preparations. He organized his journal entries, gathered the samples of poison he had collected, and prepared copies of the most damning evidence to be delivered to authorities if something happened to him. He also wrote a detailed letter explaining everything he had discovered, sealed it in an envelope addressed to Scotland Yard, and left instructions for its delivery if he failed to return to his quarters by morning. As the sun set on what might be Lord Worthington's last day of life, Thomas prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether justice would finally catch up with the woman who had believed herself beyond its reach. He had spent months watching, documenting, and planning for this moment. Now, as he checked his service revolver one final time and prepared to enter the dining room where his master was about to be served his final meal, Thomas Fletcher knew that the next few minutes would determine not only Lord Worthington's fate, but the future of everyone whose lives had been touched by Camilla's web of secrets and death. The evening of confrontation arrived with all the deceptive calm of the moments before. A hurricane strikes. Lord Worthington, unaware that this dinner might be his last, had made a remarkable effort to dress formally despite his weakness. His valet had helped him into his finest evening wear, and though his face remained pale and drawn from months of declining health, there was a spark of anticipation in his eyes that had been absent for weeks. Camilla had planned the evening with her characteristic attention to detail. She had dismissed most of the household staff for the night, claiming she wanted privacy for what she described to her husband as a romantic dinner to celebrate his recent improvement in health. The dining room had been prepared with their finest china, crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars, and an elaborate centerpiece of white roses that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. Only a few trusted servants remained in the house. Mrs. Ari. Adelaide Morris, the head housekeeper who had been in Camilla's employ since shortly after her marriage, was overseeing the final preparations in the kitchen. James Crawford, a footman whose loyalty had been purchased with generous wages and the promise of advancement, stood ready to serve the courses. And Dr. Pemberton waited in the library, officially present to monitor Lord Worthington's condition during dinner, but actually there to ensure that the final act of Camilla's plan proceeded without complications. Thomas Fletcher had positioned himself in the butler's pantry, a location that provided him with visual access to the dining room, while remaining concealed from the participants. His military training had taught him the value of reconnaissance, and he had spent the afternoon studying every detail of the room's layout, identifying potential escape routes, and planning how to position himself for maximum tactical advantage when the moment came to act. The evidence he had gathered over months of careful observation was now organized in a leather portfolio hidden beneath his jacket. Copies of his coded journal entries, samples of the poison he had intercepted, correspondence between Camilla and her accomplices, and detailed timelines correlating her actions with subsequent deaths or illnesses of her enemies. Most damning of all was a letter he had found in her private correspondence, written in her own hand to a contact in Paris, describing her methods for eliminating obstacles and discussing plans for expanding her operations to continental Europe. As the dinner hour approached, Thomas watched Camilla make her final preparations. She had changed into an elegant black silk gown that accentuated her pale skin and dark hair, creating an almost ethereal beauty that masked the calculating intelligence behind her blue eyes. She moved through the dining room like an actress preparing for her greatest performance, adjusting the placement of flowers, checking the temperature of the wine, and ensuring that every detail supported the illusion of a loving wife caring for her ailing husband. The poison that would kill Lord Worthington had been prepared in Dr. Roden, Pemberton's makeshift laboratory in the library. Thomas had observed the physician mixing the deadly compound with a medication that his master regularly took for his heart condition. The resulting mixture was virtually undetectable, designed to be administered in the wine that would be served with the final course. Death would come slowly, resembling the natural progression of heart failure that everyone expected, given Lord Worthington's declining condition. Pemberton emerged from the library carrying a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. He handed it to Camilla with the solemn expression of a physician delivering a necessary but tragic treatment. To any casual observer, the exchange would appear to be the delivery of life-saving medicine. In reality, it was the passing of an instrument of murder between two conspirators who had perfected their deadly partnership over years of practice. Lord Worthington entered the dining room supported by his walking stick, but moving with more energy than he had shown in weeks. The prospect of an intimate evening with his wife seemed to have revived his spirits, and he spoke enthusiastically about business matters and social obligations that he hoped to resume once his health fully returned. Camilla listened with apparent attention while mentally calculating the timeline for his death and the appropriate responses she would need to display for the benefit of the household staff and the physicians who would be summoned to confirm his passing. The early courses proceeded without incident. Thomas watched from his concealment as Camilla played her role to perfection, displaying concern for her husband's appetite, encouraging him to eat small portions of the carefully prepared delicacies, and maintaining the gentle conversation that characterized their private dinners. Lord Worthington seemed genuinely happy, perhaps happier than he had been since the early days of their marriage, completely unaware that his wife was counting down the minutes until she could complete her plan. As Mrs. Chaw, Morris began preparing the final course in the kitchen. Thomas made his final decision about when and how to intervene. He could wait until Camilla actually administered the poison, catching her in the act but risking Lord Worthington's life if the confrontation went badly. Alternatively, he could act before the poison was served, using his accumulated evidence to prevent the murder, but potentially allowing Camilla to deny his accusations and escape justice through her network of powerful allies. The decision was made for him when he noticed something that changed everything. Through the dining room window, he saw the silhouettes of several men approaching the house through the gardens. At first, he assumed they were additional accomplices that Camilla had summoned for reasons he had not anticipated, but as they moved closer to the windows, Thomas recognized the deliberate movements and coordinated approach of police officers conducting a raid. Someone else had been investigating Camilla Worthington. Someone with more authority and resources than a single household guard had uncovered her crimes and was moving to arrest her tonight. Thomas realized that his months of careful surveillance had coincided with an official investigation that was now coming to its conclusion. The knowledge that help was arriving changed Thomas's tactical situation completely. Instead of acting as a lone accuser whose word might be dismissed, he could now serve as a witness to support charges that were already being prepared. But the immediate danger to Lord Worthington remained unchanged. If the police were not yet aware of tonight's specific plan, they might arrive too late to prevent the administration of the fatal dose. In the dining room, Camilla had begun her final preparations. She excused herself briefly, ostensibly to check on the dessert course, but actually to retrieve the poison from where she had concealed it in a decorative vase on the sideboard. Her movements were smooth and practiced, betraying no nervousness or hesitation about what she was preparing to do. Lord Worthington waited patiently at the table, sipping his wine and admiring the roses in the centerpiece. He had no idea that his wife was preparing to murder him, that police were surrounding his house, or that his loyal guard was preparing to risk everything to save his life. In his weakened condition and trusting frame of mind, he was completely vulnerable to the woman he loved and the conspiracy she had created around him. Thomas checked his pocket watch and estimated that he had perhaps 2 minutes before Camilla returned to the dining room with the prepared poison. The police were still positioning themselves around the house, likely planning to wait until they received a signal before making their entrance. He could hear Dr. Pemberton moving around the library, probably destroying evidence or preparing for a quick escape if things went wrong. The moment of decision had arrived. Thomas could no longer wait for the police to make their move, could no longer hope that someone else would save Lord Worthington before it was too late. Everything he had learned during his months of investigation, all the evidence he had carefully gathered, would mean nothing if he allowed his master to die while help stood just outside the walls. Taking a deep breath and checking to ensure that his service revolver was ready if needed, Thomas Fletcher stepped out of his concealment and walked toward the dining room. He had served his master faithfully for 15 years, had sworn an oath to protect him from all threats, and had witnessed enough death during his military service to know that some moments demand immediate action regardless of the consequences. As he approached the dining room doors, Thomas could see Camilla returning from the sideboard with a crystal decanter that now contained not just wine, but the poison that would kill her husband. She was smiling as she walked, perhaps anticipating the freedom and power that would be hers once Lord Worthington was dead and buried. Her expression was one of triumph, the look of someone who believed that her careful planning was about to reach its successful conclusion. Lord Worthington looked up as his wife approached with the wine, his face lighting up with affection for the woman who was about to murder him. He had no suspicion, no awareness of danger, nothing but love and trust for the elegant lady who had brought such joy and purpose back into his life after years of lonely grief. Thomas reached for the dining room door handle, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether justice would finally catch up with Camilla Worthington, whether Lord Worthington would live to see another dawn, and whether the evidence he had risked everything to gather would finally expose the truth about the woman who had seemed so perfect, so loving, and so utterly beyond suspicion. The confrontation that would shatter the illusion of the perfect marriage was about to begin, and Thomas Fletcher was ready to face whatever consequences came from speaking truth to power, from challenging the woman who had believed herself untouchable, and from finally giving voice to the accusations that had been building in his mind for months. Outside, the police continued their careful approach, unaware that inside the dining room, a loyal servant was about to risk everything to save his master's life and expose the deadliest secret in all of London society. The web of lies and murder that Camilla had woven around herself was about to be torn apart, and the reckoning she had avoided for so long was finally at hand. Thomas Fletcher's hand trembled slightly as he grasped the dining room door handle. 15 years of faithful service, months of careful investigation, and a lifetime of military discipline had led to this single moment when he would either save his master's life or watch helplessly as justice failed once again. The weight of the evidence in his jacket seemed to burn against his chest, each document and sample a testament to the crimes he had witnessed and the responsibility he had accepted. Through the crack in the door, he could see Camilla approaching her husband's chair with the poisoned wine. Her movements were graceful and deliberate, like a dancer performing a choreographed routine she had rehearsed countless times. Lord Worthington sat waiting with the trusting expression of a man who had never imagined that the greatest threat to his life might come from the woman he loved most in the world. The crystal decanter caught the candlelight as Camilla prepared to pour the fatal dose. Thomas could see the slight tremor in the liquid that indicated the presence of Dr. Campbell, Pemberton's deadly compound, invisible to everyone except someone who knew what to look for. In moments, that tremor would be stilled as the poison mixed with the wine, creating a combination that would bring a peaceful death disguised as natural heart failure. Thomas pushed open the door and stepped into the dining room with the quiet confidence of a soldier advancing into enemy territory. His appearance was so sudden and unexpected that both Camilla and Lord Worthington froze in surprise. The decanter remained suspended in Camilla's hands, the wine unpoured, while her husband looked up with confusion at his guard's unprecedented intrusion into their private dinner. "Thomas?" Lord Worthington's voice carried more surprise than anger. In all their years together, the guard had never entered a room without being summoned or announced. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Thomas kept his eyes fixed on Camilla as he spoke, noting how her initial shock was already being replaced by the calculating intelligence that had served her so well in previous crises. She was evaluating him as a threat, considering her options, and planning her response with the speed of someone accustomed to thinking several moves ahead of her opponents. "Forgive me, my lord," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "But I cannot allow you to drink what your wife is preparing to serve you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon, their meaning so startling that Lord Worthington seemed unable to process them immediately. Camilla's face remained perfectly composed, but Thomas noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated she was assessing how much he knew and how dangerous he might be to her plans. "Thomas, you are clearly unwell," Camilla said, her voice carrying the concerned tone of someone addressing a confused invalid. "Perhaps you should return to your quarters and rest. We can discuss whatever has upset you in the morning." But Thomas had not survived the battlefields of Crimea and months of dangerous surveillance to be dismissed by smooth words and false concern. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather portfolio that contained his evidence, placing it on the dining table between husband and wife, like a challenge thrown down by a medieval knight. "My lord," he said, opening the portfolio to reveal its contents, "your wife has been slowly poisoning you for months. Tonight, she intends to complete the murder with the substance provided by Dr. Pemberton, who is waiting in your library at this very moment." Lord Worthington stared at the documents Thomas had spread before him, as if they were written in a foreign language. Medical reports showing the presence of exotic toxins in food samples. Detailed timelines correlating Camilla's actions with the mysterious deaths of her enemies. Copies of correspondence discussing payment for services that could only be described as murder for hire. "This is absolutely preposterous," Camilla said. But Thomas noticed that she had carefully placed the decanter back on the table without pouring its contents. Thomas has clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Perhaps the stress of his military service has finally affected his judgment. Thomas had anticipated this response. During his months of investigation, he had observed how skillfully Camilla manipulated situations to her advantage, how she could transform accusations against herself into concerns about her accuser's stability or motives. But he had prepared for this moment, with the thoroughness of a general planning a crucial battle. "My lord," Thomas said, reaching into the portfolio for a small glass vial containing a clear liquid sample, "this contains traces of the same poison that Dr. Pemberton prepared for tonight's dinner. I collected it from your morning tea 3 days ago, when Lady Worthington personally prepared your breakfast tray." He placed the vial next to the correspondence and journal entries, creating a collection of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of systematic murder. Lord Worthington picked up one of the letters, his hands shaking as he recognized his wife's distinctive handwriting describing methods for eliminating obstacles to her plans. "Camilla," Lord Worthington whispered, his voice breaking with the pain of betrayal rather than physical illness. "Is this true? Have you been trying to kill me?" For the first time since Thomas had known her, Camilla's perfect composure cracked slightly. She looked at her husband with something that might have been genuine emotion, though Thomas suspected it was more likely frustration at having her carefully constructed plan disrupted at the moment of its completion. "Harrison, you must understand," she said, reaching toward him with hands that he instinctively drew away from. "Everything I've done has been for us, for our future together. There are forces working against our family, people who want to destroy everything we have built." But Lord Worthington was no longer listening to her explanations. He was reading through Thomas's documentation with the focused attention of a man discovering that his entire world had been built on lies. The evidence was overwhelming in its detail and devastating in its implications. Every illness, every weakness, every moment when he had felt grateful for his wife's devoted care now appeared in a new and terrible light. Thomas moved closer to the table, positioning himself between Camilla and the door, while keeping both hands visible to demonstrate that he posed no immediate physical threat. He had learned from his military experience that dangerous situations could escalate quickly if participants felt cornered or desperate. "The authorities are already aware of your activities, Lady Worthington," Thomas said quietly. "Scotland Yard has been conducting their own investigation based on information provided by Dr. Pemberton himself." This statement was partially a bluff, but Thomas had seen enough evidence of police presence around the house to be confident that some form of official action was imminent. He hoped that the suggestion of Dr. Pemberton's cooperation might encourage Camilla to surrender rather than attempting to escape or eliminate witnesses. Camilla's eyes flashed with anger at the mention of her accomplice's possible betrayal. For a moment, her mask of elegant respectability slipped completely, revealing the cold fury of someone whose carefully constructed empire was crumbling around her. "That cowardly fool!" she hissed, apparently forgetting her audience in her rage at Dr. Pemberton's disloyalty. "I should have eliminated him months ago instead of trusting him with such sensitive work." The admission hung in the air like a confession, confirming everything that Thomas had suspected about her methods and her willingness to kill anyone who threatened her secrets. Lord Worthington stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his face pale with shock and growing recognition of how completely he had been deceived. A sound from the hallway indicated that the police were finally making their move. Thomas could hear multiple footsteps approaching the dining room, accompanied by voices giving orders and coordinating their entrance. The investigation that had been proceeding parallel to his own surveillance was finally reaching its conclusion. Camilla heard the sounds as well, and Thomas watched her calculate her remaining options with the speed of someone accustomed to crisis management. She could attempt to flee, but the house was clearly surrounded. She could try to destroy evidence, but Thomas's documentation provided enough corroboration to support the official investigation. She could attempt to eliminate witnesses, But Thomas was prepared for violence, and the police were too close to allow time for additional murders. "You have destroyed everything," she said to Thomas, her voice carrying the venom of someone who had never before been outmaneuvered so completely. "Do you have any idea what you have thrown away?" "The power, the influence, the ability to shape the future of this country." Thomas met her gaze without flinching. He had faced enemy artillery and cavalry charges, had watched good men die for causes they believed in, and had learned that some principles were worth any personal cost. "I swore an oath to protect my master," he said simply. "Tonight I kept that oath." The dining room door burst open as Scotland Yard detectives entered, with weapons drawn, followed by uniformed constables, who quickly positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at escape. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Morrison, a man Thomas recognized from newspaper accounts of high-profile investigations, surveyed the scene with the professional assessment of someone who had encountered many similar situations. "Lady Camilla Worthington," the inspector said formally, "you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Edmund Hartwell and conspiracy to commit the murder of Lord Harrison Worthington." As the constables moved to place her in custody, Camilla maintained her dignity with the same skill she had displayed throughout her rise to power. She allowed herself to be handcuffed without resistance, her expression revealing nothing of the calculations that must have been racing through her mind as she considered her legal options and the resources she might still be able to mobilize in her defense. Lord Worthington sat in stunned silence as the woman he had loved and trusted was led away in chains. The evidence of her betrayal lay scattered across the dining table like the fragments of their destroyed marriage, each document a testament to how completely she had deceived him and how close he had come to becoming her final victim. Thomas remained at attention as the police completed their work, his military bearing intact despite the emotional toll of the evening's revelations. He had accomplished his mission, saved his master's life, and ensured that justice would finally catch up with someone who had believed herself beyond its reach. But the victory felt hollow as he watched Lord Worthington grapple with the knowledge that the woman he had loved had been slowly killing him for months. The confrontation was over, but Thomas knew that the consequences would echo through their lives for years to come. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, but the cost of that truth would leave scars that might never fully heal. As the police escorted their prisoner from the dining room, Thomas Fletcher prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that he had done his duty, but wondering if that duty had been worth the price they had all paid for its completion. The weeks following Camilla's arrest transformed Worthington Manor from a centre of London's social power into a place of profound silence and reflection. Lord Worthington, slowly recovering from months of systematic poisoning, spent long hours in his library trying to reconcile the woman he had loved with the monster who had been revealed through Thomas Fletcher's investigation and the subsequent police inquiry. The newspapers had seized upon the story with the enthusiasm of journalists who had discovered the scandal of the century. "The Black Widow of Belgravia" became the headline that defined Camilla's public identity, though Thomas knew the reality was far more complex and disturbing than any newspaper could convey. The woman who had nearly succeeded in creating an international network of influence and murder had become a symbol of how power could corrupt absolutely, and how the appearance of respectability could mask the darkest of intentions. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison had quickly realized that Thomas's evidence was crucial to building a comprehensive case against Camilla and her network of accomplices. The guard's months of careful observation and documentation provided the timeline and corroborating details that transformed suspicions into prosecutable charges. Dr. Pemberton, faced with overwhelming evidence of his complicity, had agreed to testify against his former employer in exchange for a reduced sentence. The investigation revealed the full scope of Camilla's criminal enterprise. Over the course of 5 years, she had been responsible for at least 12 deaths and countless cases of mysterious illness among London's elite. Her victims included judges who had ruled against her interests, business rivals who had threatened her investments, journalists who had questioned her activities, and politicians who had opposed her policy preferences. Each murder had been carefully planned and expertly executed to appear as natural death or accident. The exotic poison, Dr. Coffin, Pemberton had provided was virtually undetectable using conventional medical examination techniques of the era, and Camilla's position in society had protected her from the kind of scrutiny that might have revealed her crimes earlier. Thomas found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of key witness and public hero. Newspapers hailed him as the loyal servant whose dedication had saved his master and exposed a network of murder that threatened the very foundations of British society. But he took no pleasure in the attention, knowing that his success had come at the cost of Lord Worthington's happiness and trust in human nature. The trial of Camilla Worthington became the most sensational legal proceeding in London's recent memory. The courtroom was packed daily with representatives of every major newspaper, curious members of the public, and the same social elite who had once competed for invitations to her dinner parties. Many of those present were there as much to confirm their own safety as to see justice done. Having realized how close they had come to becoming victims themselves, Camilla's legal team, the finest that money could hire, mounted a defense that attempted to portray her as the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by jealous rivals and disgruntled servants. They suggested that Thomas Fletcher had fabricated evidence out of resentment over his lowly position, that Dr. Pemberton had acted independently in supplying poison, and that their client was guilty of nothing more than being an intelligent woman who had succeeded in a man's world. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony devastating. Thomas took the stand for 3 days, methodically presenting his documentation and explaining the investigative methods he had used to uncover the truth. His military bearing and obvious sincerity made him a compelling witness, and his detailed knowledge of Camilla's activities left little room for doubt about her guilt. Dr. Pemberton's testimony provided the technical details about the poisons and their effects, while also revealing the business-like nature of Camilla's approach to murder. She had paid him a regular retainer for his services, provided bonuses for particularly challenging assignments, and maintained a professional relationship that treated death as simply another tool for achieving her goals. The prosecution called witnesses from across London society who testified about suspicious deaths and illnesses that had occurred after conflicts with Camilla. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic elimination of obstacles, carried out with such skill that each individual incident had seemed like natural misfortune rather than deliberate murder. Perhaps most damaging to Camilla's defense was the testimony of Mrs. Barr, Adelaide Morris, the head housekeeper who had been discovered to have knowledge of her mistress's crimes but had remained silent out of fear. Under oath, she described witnessing Camilla preparing special meals for guests, disposing of suspicious substances, and meeting with Dr. Pemberton and other accomplices in the privacy of her study. Lord Worthington testified with visible difficulty, his voice breaking as he described his gradual recognition that the woman he had trusted with his life had been systematically destroying it. His testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had genuinely loved Camilla and who had no motive for false accusations beyond a desire to see justice done. The defense's attempts to discredit the evidence and witnesses failed to overcome the sheer weight of documentation and corroboration that Thomas had provided. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with verdicts of guilty on all charges, including 12 counts of murder in the first degree and conspiracy to commit numerous additional crimes. When the judge pronounced the sentence of death by hanging, Camilla received the news with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the trial. She showed no emotion, made no final statement, and accepted her fate with the bearing of someone who had always understood that her games carried ultimate stakes. In the months that followed, appeals were filed and legal procedures exhausted, but the evidence was too strong and the crimes too heinous for any higher court to overturn the conviction. Camilla spent her final weeks in Newgate Prison, reportedly using the time to write memoirs that would never be published and to maintain correspondence with contacts across Europe who were gradually distancing themselves from her tainted reputation. Thomas returned to his duties at Worthington Manor, but the dynamic of the household had changed forever. Lord Worthington, though physically recovering from the effects of the poison, remained emotionally devastated by the betrayal he had experienced. The man who had once been one of London's most prominent social figures withdrew from public life, conducting his business affairs through intermediaries and rarely entertaining guests in the home where he had nearly been murdered. The wider effects of Camilla's exposure rippled through London society for years. The investigation had revealed corruption and complicity among doctors, lawyers, servants, and officials who had enabled her crimes or looked the other way in exchange for various benefits. Profits. Several prominent figures faced their own trials or resigned from positions in disgrace as the full extent of the network was revealed. Thomas found that his role in exposing the crimes had earned him both admiration and resentment from different segments of society. Many praised him as a hero who had risked everything to serve justice, but others viewed him with suspicion as a servant who had betrayed his mistress and violated the traditional loyalty expected from his position. The experience had changed Thomas as well. His months of investigation had shown him depths of human evil that his military service had not prepared him for. War, for all its horrors, at least involved enemies who acknowledged their hostility. Camilla's crimes had been committed under the guise of love, charity, and social responsibility, revealing how completely appearances could deceive even those closest to the truth. On the morning of Camilla's execution, Thomas stood at his post outside Lord Worthington's library, maintaining his vigil as he had for 15 years. The newspapers would report that she went to her death with dignity, showing no remorse for her crimes and no fear of the punishment she faced. Some observers interpreted this as evidence of her innocence, while others saw it as proof of the calculating nature that had made her so dangerous. Lord Worthington emerged from his library that morning, looking older than his years, but with a clarity in his eyes that had been absent since the night of the confrontation. He approached Thomas with the slow steps of a man who had aged decades in a few months, but who had finally found some measure of peace. "Thomas," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that justice has been served today. But more importantly, I wanted to thank you for saving my life, even though it cost us both so much." Thomas nodded respectfully, understanding that his master was acknowledging not just the physical salvation from poison, but the deeper rescue from a relationship built on lies and manipulation. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating in ways that would take years to fully appreciate. As the years passed, the Worthington Manor gradually returned to a kind of normalcy, though it was forever changed by the events that had unfolded in its dining room. Thomas continued his faithful service, but with the knowledge that his loyalty had been tested in ways he had never imagined, and had proven strong enough to overcome even the most powerful deceptions. The story of Camilla Worthington became a cautionary tale told in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across London, a reminder that evil could wear the mask of beauty and respectability, and that the greatest dangers often came from those who appeared most trustworthy. But for Thomas Fletcher, it remained something more personal. Proof that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in grand gestures on battlefields, but in quiet acts of observation, documentation, and moral clarity when confronting those who believe themselves above justice. In the end, the woman who had proclaimed herself beyond the reach of consequences had learned that no one, regardless of wealth, beauty, or influence, could escape the reckoning that comes to those who choose to build their power on the graves of others. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied, and the loyal servant who had refused to look away when others preferred comfortable blindness had ensured that truth would finally prevail over even the most carefully constructed deceptions.